Today I'm here with Kathleen Dollar. Kathleen, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
I've heard you on podcasts. I've read your work, and I'm a fan.
Thank you.
I've been doing a lot of talks on Managed Extensibility Framework, MEF, and I know you've got a lot more experience at that than I have. So can you first of all define for us what is MEF?
Okay, so it stands for the Managed Extensibility Framework, and at one level it really does involve extensibility. It involves plugins, and so plugins are a really important part of the story. But it's only one part of the story because it's a way that we can build in Lego blocks at the level of the .NET framework. It's defined at that level. So one way we might want to do like a Lego block kind of thinking is to say that somebody else, one of our clients, us for different clients, different groups within an organization, do different parts, different Lego blocks, and they fit together. And MEF's job is to fit them together.
Okay.
So that's one way that we can do it, and that's the way that the name implies.
All right,
is
so
the
when you say
plugin model.
Lego blocks, you're talking about pieces of an application that exist independently of one another and are coupled together by some glue.
Right, so they are pieces of the application. They're called parts in MEF. So if I use this phrase parts, that's what I mean. And they're just pieces that go together. They are defined by a contract. The contract is a string, but in one of the most common cases, it is the string name of an interface. And we hand off to MEF the interface because that way we don't have to worry about the string. And MEF works with it as a string. It does that so that it has no dependencies on the, as it passes it around, it has no dependencies on the type. And so it uses a string internally, which is a good thing, but we get to use it as a type, as the interface type. So we just say, here is the interface that we're working with this part, and MEF takes care of the rest.
Okay, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to get their head around.
It is.
Go into a little more detail. What is a contract, and what does that look like in a .NET application?
Okay, so within a .NET application, a contract is generally going to be an interface. It's not the only kind of interface, but it's the most common one. And we're going to say that a particular part either needs or offers a particular interface. So for example, we might have a class, and that class might implement an interface. Let's just say iFoo. Okay, so we have an iFoo interface on a particular class, and we add an extra attribute. In the most common case, we add an extra attribute that says I export iFoo. And then something else in the whole application might need one. And it's going to import that, often as a field. It could also be a property. But it's going to import that by simply adding the attribute import to the declaration of the variable. The variable would be defined with the type iFoo. And from that, MEF is going to stand up and say, well, this guy, this one particular thing in the container, needs an iFoo. Where do I have an iFoo I can give to it? And it's going to make that connection for us. And all we had to do to get it started, the only part that the programmer has to do is to compose the MEF container, which just means create a container so it exists. That's about 10 lines of code. And then they need to put attributes on the things that they want put into the container. And the import and export attributes define the thing. I sometimes think of it as a room full of kindergarten students. And you know how kindergarten students, they always want to help. And so one kindergarten student says, I need a red crayon. And another kindergarten student says, oh, I've got a red crayon I can give you. And MEF, because nobody's allowed in this kindergarten class to get out of their seats, takes the red crayon and gives it to the person who needs the red crayon. So this is our application able to do that without us having to worry about the mucky details of that. And it just makes it easier to do plugins with that model than having to define it yourself.
Okay, and this is distinct from if we have the most applications that I write. If I have a part of my application that wants to consume some other part of the application, in other words, I want to import some export somewhere, I would have set an explicit reference to the assembly where that was.
Right.
And with MEF, I don't need to do that.
That's
MEF takes care of that.
Yes, it's a very, very important point.
But how does MEF know where to find the exports?
And there's a couple of different ways. So I'm going to start out explaining the simple way, that what comes in the box with MEF, and then hopefully before we're done, I can talk for just a minute about extensibility on that.
Okay.
So you're right, we don't want to make those hard references because those hard references are strong coupling, and they cause us trouble later. We can't replace different parts. We have to version together because everybody has to know exactly who they're talking to. And there's a lot of problems along that way. With MEF, the most common way is that we're going to talk about assemblies. And so they could be an explicit assembly. I want you to use this assembly. But more often it's just a directory. And we tell MEF to go look in this directory. It looks in that directory, looks at the manifest for each DLL in the directory, which means it doesn't have to fully load it. It looks at the manifest, pulls from the manifest the information it needs about what attributes are in use. From that, it builds a dictionary internally about who needs what and how it's going to keep it all straight. And that's relatively quick to do. It does have to do a touch on the file, so it has to do a file open to get a hold of the manifest. That takes a tiny bit of time. And it has to build the dictionary. That takes a tiny bit of time. So it's not totally free at setup, but it does allow you to late load entire assemblies. Because when you talked about those hard references and direct references, in that case, all those assemblies are loaded when we start up our application. Mm-hmm. And so now we're able to delay that. So while overall it's a little bit slower, we can actually sometimes get better feeling performance depending on how we're using MEF to do delayed loading.
Oh, better performance than actually setting explicit references.
It changes the time we're doing it. We have the same amount of work, but let's say that we have 5 different assemblies and right now we're loading all 5 of them when the application starts up. Right. But 3 of them we only need if the user selects a particular menu item. What we can do is we can load the ones we actually do need, and then those extra assemblies that are only needed when certain menu items are selected, we can wait until the user actually selects those menu items, okay. And at that point the assembly is fully loaded, ready to go. But it does allow us to delay some of that work.
Okay. So one of the things I'm struggling with is finding scenarios where MEF is applicable. I know Visual Studio 2010 is using MEF extensively throughout there. Microsoft is dogfooding this application there. But I don't know what else is going on in the world. There's just not a lot of SEMs. Tell me where this would be used.
Right. Well, there's not, and I think it's important to remember when we ask some of these questions about why, what do we do with it, where are we going with it? It's a very, very, very young technology.
Sure. It's a CTP 6.
It's a pre-CTP. Okay. It's called a preview because it's not even really a CTP. What Microsoft did is released the source code. Actually, it's an open source project at one level. Released what they were planning on implementing, and they've been doing that all along. The most recent one is Preview 6, so we've had this coming along since PDC. We had a lot of changes, so it's still stabilizing. I think it's something for people to plan for, but not necessarily grab onto today. It will be in .NET 4.0 in the framework, so that we definitely have a lot to look forward to. So getting back to your question about scenarios, I look at the scenarios in 3 big groups. One group we talked about, which is plugins. So perhaps I have an application and it's going to look at doing sales tax, but I only want to write the sales tax portion of the application once I sell into an area that we have some concern about. I don't want to write it for every single place in the whole United States. Right. So I'm going to add these on. So the one way I could do that is to create a plugin model and then have those made available as I just drop them out into that directory and have them become available. Another type of scenario you mentioned with Visual Studio. And so these are very overlapping scenarios. It's a way to think about MEF, and that is the ecosystem application. So Visual Studio is a fairly robust ecosystem application. There's a pretty beefy starting point.
Define that word, ecosystem.
But by an ecosystem application, I mean an application that's going to give you something to start with. But the majority of what goes on, the majority of what happens is done by different parts talking to each other. And the core doesn't really care what those parts are doing, or it only cares about how you drop into them. So one example is within Visual Studio, when we look at text that has a particular color, 2 things happen. First, Visual Studio goes out and it says, can you classify this for me? And so something may be classified as a keyword or as a comment. And then it goes off and goes on and colorizes that with a separate tool. Those are both MEF pieces. They're both MEF parts in Visual Studio 2010. So the ecosystem aspect of that is when it goes out and asks about classifying something, that step can go off and look at as much other stuff as it needs to. And we can have new relationships built behind the scenes. So we have the initial relationship that is between Visual Studio and a classifier of some sort. but we can also have additional relationships that that classifier has, and that's where the ecosystem idea comes in.
Okay.
Is that we have this nest, and different things can play, different things can come in, and the core application doesn't really care what all is going out there at a little bit of a distance from it.
Okay, so this is the primary architecture. MEF is running entirely through the architecture of this application.
Yes, this would be Visual Studio 2010 is deeply embedded in MEF, and this is a kind of architecture. This particular classification of MEF designs is one where it makes sense for MEF to be. It's a critical part of doing the application.
Right.
We would architect everything differently. I'm aware of two categories of that. One of which is editors, and we're following along some of what Eclipse has been doing for a long time in the Java world, and now Visual Studio is able to do some of those things, and it is doing them through MEF. Another one is a process runner. I have one that I use for generating code, but it actually can run any process in the universe. And so a general purpose process running tool, which allows you to script a set of processes in a completely open, extensible ecosystem type way, can be very valuable for certain types of problems. There may be more ecosystem apps. I haven't thought of them.
Right.
So we have a third area, a third type of scenario that we can look at, and this is ultimately the most exciting. This is the really fun one, and that is that we can now create new types of architectures. And by one way, just to keep it very simple now, but I think we'll take this far beyond this initial level, is imagine that you have an application and it finds its data access pieces via MEF. It's an MVVM architecture, and the model is, well, the modifying the view model might be a little bit more set up because the data binding, but the view model is finding the model that it's going to talk to via MEF. So, or the model, or some other scenario, is working with MEF to find the right wrapper for the proxies to go across into a service call. So all of these are scenarios that are deeply architecturally focused. They're not focused on solving a particular business problem with a plugin. They're solved in changing the way we do architecture. Now, as we go down this route, and if we imagine that logically we have maybe a half a dozen to a dozen real architectures. We have millions in the wild, hundreds of millions in the wild,
right.
But they really drop down to a handful of ideas.
Okay.
If we look at the boundaries that are defined within each of those 6 or 12 architectures, and we manage to get some consistent interfaces on there, now I can take my view model and talk to your model, can talk to Carl Franklin or somebody else's piece that is expressing the proxy wrapper. And so we're able to fundamentally, at the deepest possible level, redefine what architecture really means. And we can go back, and instead of it being this big stack that we're having to do consistently across to make it work, we have the potential to redefine that. And ultimately, that's why I'm excited about MEF. The rest of it, it's important to a tool I've written. I'm very happy Microsoft's committed to it.
Okay.
The plugin model is nice, but the core thing that I think we're all going to look back, and I think this is actually it's a watershed time where we're kind of at the top of the roller coaster.
Right.
And the reason I think that is because of the architecture implications of having a true composable model. We've had things around the edges. Certainly, MEF does not represent entirely new thinking. It was built on a lot of good stuff that's already been out there. But for us today, in terms of core, committed, Microsoft will keep this inside the framework really forever. It's in the heart of the .NET framework. We haven't had that. And we can now open up a whole new type of architecting and thinking about applications that we couldn't have before. That's why I get really excited about MEF.
I'm getting excited about it as well. Before we go, tell me about your product.
Okay, so it's not a product. Well, I have two things. Okay, so let me just real quickly do
What do you
it.
use as MEF?
My MEF thing it is a code generator. It's a code generation harness, and what it allows me to do, and this gives it may help understand ecosystem scenarios, is that I have metadata is core to creating doing code generation. We have some sort of information about what we want to build, and we have a template. And the only thing that the harness really does is find those things that have the right interface for a template, which I call an iProcess wrapper, because it could just as easily be loading store procedures into a database or anything else.
Okay.
These, I call the templates that are available and say, run yourself. That's all I do. That's all the harness needs to do. Establish the container and say, go run yourself. Each template can stand up and say, what I need is this kind of metadata, who has it? What I need is this other thing, who has it? It's a little more complexity than that under the hood, but that really talks about how it works with MEF and why that's a true ecosystem application. Because I frankly don't want to worry about what template idea you may come up with, because you may be smarter than I and come up with a brand new way to do things that's absolutely fabulous. And then the metadata you create, I want you to hit that on the interface, because I don't want a strong coupling between the storage mechanism of that, which today is XML, and tomorrow may be a textual DSL like Oslo, and the next day after that something else. I want us to come across that boundary to a fixed interface, and then that can worry behind the scenes about what the actual structure is, which loses, that we can be very brittle in that section of how the metadata is defined.
Okay.
So that's kind of an overview of that. I also work for a company called AppVenture, and AppVenture has an entirely separate tool called Foundations, which I'm very proud of, but we won't talk about today because it's different than this.
But with the MEF, I just want to make sure I understand the reason you're using MEF to do this is so that you're now decoupling basically the engine that does the code generation from the metadata storage and from the templates.
Yes,
so that you can swap those out.
I'm decoupling everything. I want to decouple myself from the situation because I want people to be able to use their own creativity. I don't want them to be necessarily following my models.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And where can people find out more about
my blog? My blog is probably a great place to go, and that would be msmvp.com/blog/Kathleen. I will also be blogging, because I blog 2 places, at www.appventure, which is appventure.com. And you go to blogs there and you'll find some stuff. I'm just kind of moving the code generation strict stuff over there. MEF will stay on my own blog.
Kathleen, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. You're obviously very knowledgeable about this.
Well, thank you.
All right.
So it's been great seeing you here at DevLink, where we get to learn about all this technology with all these friends. It's wonderful.